He thought humiliating her would be harmless. But within minutes, the entire room would realize they had been standing in the presence of someone who owned everything around them. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe respect should never be based on appearances, make sure to follow along, because stories like this remind us what dignity really looks like. The 42nd floor of Carter and Hale Industries gleamed under soft white lighting, polished marble stretching wall to wall, reflecting the quiet hum of success that lived in every corner of the building. Executives moved with purpose, heels clicking, voices low but confident, each conversation wrapped in ambition and status. And in the middle of it all, almost invisible, was a woman in a simple gray janitor uniform, her movements slow, deliberate, steady as she guided a mop across the spotless floor. Evelyn Carter kept her eyes down, her posture relaxed, as if she had nowhere important to be, as if she didn't belong in a place like this. Most people didn't even notice her, and the ones who did quickly dismissed her. At exactly 9:12 a.m., Brandon Cole stepped out of the glass conference room, adjusting the cuff of his tailored navy suit, his expression sharp with self-importance. He had just finished leading a strategy meeting, and the faint smirk on his face made it clear he believed it had gone perfectly. His team followed behind him, nodding, laughing lightly at his remarks, eager to stay in his good graces. Brandon paused mid-step when his eyes landed on Evelyn. The mop, the uniform, the quiet presence in a place he considered exclusive. His lips curled slightly. Unbelievable, he muttered just loud enough for those around him to hear. A few heads turned. A few smirks formed. Evelyn continued her work, unfazed, the rhythmic motion of the mop steady against the marble, the faint squeak echoing softly through the corridor. Brandon took a step closer, his polished shoes stopping inches from the freshly cleaned surface. "Hey," he called out, louder now, drawing more attention. "You might want to be more careful. This is the executive floor." A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the small crowd forming behind him. Evelyn paused for just a second, then looked up. Her eyes were calm, steady, almost too composed for someone being addressed like that. "I am being careful," she replied softly. Her voice was even, respectful, controlled. That only seemed to amuse him more. Brandon let out a short laugh, glancing at his colleagues as if inviting them to share the moment. "Right?" he said, nodding slowly, "just making sure. Wouldn't want someone out of place causing problems up here." The words hung in the air longer than necessary. A subtle jab, a clear line drawn. The group behind him chuckled under their breath. Evelyn lowered her gaze again, returning to her work without another word. But something about her silence wasn't submission. It wasn't discomfort. It was deliberate. Brandon tilted his head slightly, studying her now, as if something about her composure irritated him more than it should have. "You know," he added, stepping just a little closer, lowering his voice but not enough to keep others from hearing. "People up here have spent years earning their place. It's not somewhere you just wander into." The hallway grew quieter. Even the distant hum of conversation seemed to fade. Evelyn stopped again, just for a moment, the mop stilled in her hands. Then slowly, she reached into the pocket of her uniform, her movements calm, unhurried, almost precise, as if every second was intentional. And somewhere in the back of the room, someone shifted uncomfortably, though they couldn't quite explain why. The moment her hand slipped into the pocket of that worn gray uniform, something shifted in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the room itself was holding its breath without knowing why. Brandon noticed it, though he could not explain it, and instead of stepping back, he leaned further in, doubling down on the authority he believed he held. "I hope you understand," he said, his tone sharpening just enough to cut. "This floor is restricted for a reason. It is not just about cleaning. It is about maintaining a certain standard." A few of his colleagues nodded, arms folded, watching closely. Now, their earlier amusement turning into quiet curiosity. Evelyn slowly pulled out her phone, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, almost detached, as if she had already seen how this moment would end. She glanced briefly at the screen, then back at Brandon, meeting his gaze fully for the first time. There was no challenge in her eyes, no anger, only a calm certainty that made his confidence flicker for just a fraction of a second. "Is there something else you need?" she asked gently. The question caught him off guard, not because of the words, but because of the tone. It was not submissive. It was not defensive. It was neutral, controlled, almost as if she were the one setting the terms of the conversation. Brandon let out a short laugh to recover, glancing around to make sure his audience was still with him. "What I need," he said, raising his voice slightly, "is for people to understand their role. That is how companies function. That is how success is built." His words echoed against the marble, louder than necessary, turning a quiet corridor into a stage. A few more employees slowed their steps, drawn in by the tension. Evelyn listened without interruption, then nodded once, as if acknowledging a point in a meeting rather than a public reprimand. "I agree," she said softly. "Understanding roles is important." The simplicity of her response seemed to encourage him. Brandon took another step closer, his posture taller, his voice firmer. "Then I suggest you return to the lower floors where you belong. We cannot have distractions up here." The word distractions lingered, heavier than it should have been. For a moment, no one spoke. The faint hum of the building returned, distant and muted. Evelyn's grip on the mop loosened slightly before she set it aside, carefully, almost ceremoniously, as if finishing a task that mattered. Then she looked at her phone again and pressed a single contact. The call connected almost instantly. "Please come upstairs," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying just enough to reach the surrounding ears. "Yes, right now." She ended the call without another word and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Brandon frowned slightly, the first crack in his composure beginning to show. "Calling maintenance?" he asked with a smirk, though it sounded less certain than before. Evelyn did not answer. She simply stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, her posture straight, her presence suddenly impossible to ignore. Seconds passed. Then the sound of rapid footsteps approached from the far end of the hallway, sharp against the marble, purposeful, urgent. Heads turned. Conversations stopped completely. 3 figures appeared, moving quickly, their expressions focused, their pace unmistakably deliberate. The moment they reached Evelyn, they did not hesitate. One of them stepped forward slightly, his voice respectful, almost formal. "Miss Carter," he said. And just like that, the entire room went silent. The name hung in the air like something heavy and irreversible, settling over every person in that hallway with a weight no one could ignore. Miss Carter. Not janitor. Not staff. Not someone out of place. Brandon's smile froze mid-expression, his mind scrambling to reconcile what he had just heard with what he thought he knew. He looked from the 3 sharply dressed executives to Evelyn, then back again, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, a mistake, anything that would restore the version of reality where he was still in control. But there was none. The man who had spoken stepped slightly aside, revealing the other 2 standing just behind him, both nodding respectfully, their posture straight, their attention fixed entirely on Evelyn. One of them held a tablet close to his chest, the other glanced briefly around the room before lowering his gaze, as if acknowledging that something important had just shifted. Evelyn met their eyes with a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice calm, steady, completely unchanged. There was no trace of triumph in her tone, no hint that she had just turned the entire situation upside down. That was what made it even more unsettling. Brandon swallowed, the confidence that had filled his voice just moments ago now gone, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. I am sorry," he began, his words stumbling over each other as he tried to recover. "I think there has been some kind of confusion here." His attempt at control sounded thin, fragile, like a script that no longer fit the scene. Evelyn turned her gaze back to him, and for the first time, the silence between them carried authority. Not loud, not aggressive, just undeniable. "There is no confusion," she said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The words landed with precision. Around them, employees stood completely still, no one daring to whisper, no one willing to move. The earlier laughter had disappeared, replaced by a quiet tension that filled the space from wall to wall. Brandon forced a tight smile, adjusting his tie as if the familiar motion might ground him. "Of course," he said quickly. "I just meant if I had known." He stopped himself, realizing too late how those words sounded. If I had known. The implication was clear. Evelyn's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened, not with anger, but with clarity. "If you had known," she repeated softly, letting the phrase linger just long enough for everyone to hear it. No one spoke. No one even shifted their weight. The entire floor seemed suspended in that moment. She took a small step forward, closing the distance between them, not in confrontation, but in presence. "Would that have changed how you spoke to me?" she asked. The question was simple, direct, and impossible to answer without revealing something deeper. Brandon opened his mouth, then closed it again. The polished answers he had relied on in meetings, the confident tone he used with clients, none of it worked here. Not now. Not under the weight of that question. Evelyn held his gaze for a second longer, then turned slightly toward the group behind him, her eyes moving across the faces that had watched, laughed, and said nothing. "This company was built on one principle," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach everyone without effort. "Respect is not tied to titles. It is not earned by position. It is revealed by behavior." The words settled over the room, quiet but absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. And in that silence, Brandon finally understood that whatever came next would not be loud, would not be dramatic, but it would be something he would never forget. The silence that followed her words was not empty. It was heavy, deliberate, pressing against every person in that hallway, as if demanding reflection whether they were ready for it or not. Brandon felt it first, that quiet shift where control slips away without noise, without warning, and leaves nothing behind to hold on to. His throat tightened as he tried to steady himself, his usual confidence now replaced with something unfamiliar, something fragile. "Ms. Carter," he said carefully, forcing his voice into a tone that sounded almost respectful, though it came too late. "I assure you, that is not how I intended any of this to come across." The words sounded polished, rehearsed, the kind he had used countless times to smooth over tense situations, but here, in this moment, they felt hollow. Evelyn watched him without interrupting, her expression composed, her posture unchanged, as if she had heard variations of that sentence more times than anyone in the room could imagine. "Intent," she said quietly, "is often the excuse people rely on when they are forced to face the impact of their actions." Her voice did not rise, yet it carried further than anything he had said earlier. A few employees lowered their eyes. Others stood frozen, their earlier confidence replaced with unease. Brandon nodded quickly, eager to agree, eager to regain some footing. "You are absolutely right," he said, almost too quickly, "and I take full responsibility. I should have handled the situation differently." He paused, searching her face for any sign that he was saying the right thing, that he could still repair what had already unfolded. But Evelyn did not give him that reassurance. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the small crowd that had gathered, her eyes meeting theirs one by one, not accusing, not harsh, but aware. "This was not just one moment," she continued, her voice steady. "It was a pattern. Subtle, perhaps. Easy to overlook when you benefit from it." The words landed softly, but they lingered, settling into the space. Between them, Brandon's shoulders dropped slightly, the weight of the situation becoming impossible to ignore. "I understand," he said, quieter now, his voice no longer trying to perform. "And I will make sure it never happens again." Evelyn looked back at him, studying him for a brief moment, as if measuring not just his words, but the space behind them. Then she nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. "Accountability is not proven in promises," she said. "It is proven in what happens after the room is no longer watching." The statement hung in the air, quiet but definitive. One of the executives beside her shifted slightly, glancing at Brandon before returning his attention to Evelyn, awaiting her next words. Brandon straightened instinctively, sensing that something final was approaching, something that would define how this moment would be remembered. Evelyn took a small step back, creating space, not distance, but clarity. "Effective immediately," she said, her tone unchanged. "You will step away from your current leadership responsibilities." The words were simple, direct, delivered without hesitation. A ripple moved through the group, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. Brandon's face tightened, his breath catching for just a second before he regained control. "I understand," he said, though the words carried a weight he could not fully conceal. Evelyn continued, her gaze steady. "You will remain with the company under review. Not because mistakes are unforgivable, but because culture is not built on talent alone. She let that settle before adding, "It is built on how people are treated when there is nothing to gain from it." No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt. The authority in her presence did not come from volume or force. It came from certainty, from consistency, from the quiet understanding that she did not need to prove who she was. Brandon lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in realization, the kind that arrives too late to change what has already been done. Around him, the employees who had once laughed now stood in complete silence, their expressions thoughtful, unsettled, reflective. Evelyn glanced once more at the polished floor, at the mop resting where she had left it, then back at the people standing before her. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, she made something clear that no one in that room would forget. Respect had never been about position. And today, everyone had just learned exactly what that meant. The weight of her decision settled over the room long after the words had been spoken, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were final, precise, and impossible to misunderstand. No one rushed to speak. No one tried to fill the silence. Even the usual sounds of the office, the quiet hum of conversation, the tapping of keyboards, seemed to hold back, as if the entire floor understood that something deeper than a simple correction had just taken place. Brandon remained still, his posture no longer commanding, no longer certain, but reflective, as if for the first time he was seeing the environment around him without the filter of status and control. The executives beside Evelyn stepped back slightly, not out of distance, but out of respect, allowing her presence to define the moment without interruption. Evelyn glanced once more across the faces gathered before her, not searching for reactions, but acknowledging them, each expression telling its own quiet story of realization. Some looked down, avoiding her gaze. Others stood straighter, as if recalibrating themselves in real time. A few simply watched, absorbing the lesson without fully understanding it yet. She then turned her attention back to the space itself, the polished marble floors, the glass walls, the carefully designed environment that projected success to the outside world. For a brief second, her eyes softened, not with emotion, but with recognition, as if remembering something far older than this moment. "This building," she said quietly, her voice steady, "was never meant to impress people. It was meant to reflect how we treat them." The statement moved through the room slowly, like something that needed time to be understood. Brandon lifted his head slightly, his expression no longer defensive, but thoughtful, the earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet awareness he could not ignore. Evelyn took a step toward the mop she had set aside, her movements unhurried, grounded, as if returning to something unfinished. She rested her hand lightly on the handle, then paused, turning back one last time. "Titles can be given," she continued, her voice calm, "but respect is always revealed." No one responded. No one needed to. The truth in her words had already settled into the space, into the people, into the moment itself. She gave a small nod to the executives, who immediately stepped into motion, not with urgency, but with quiet efficiency, already beginning to carry out what had been decided. Brandon remained where he stood, not because he was told to, but because he understood that moving too quickly would mean missing what had just happened. Around him, the employees slowly began to disperse, not with their usual energy, but with a subdued awareness, their conversations quieter, their expressions more measured. The laughter that had filled the hallway earlier had vanished completely, replaced by something far more lasting. Evelyn lowered her gaze to the floor once more and resumed her work, guiding the mop across the marble with the same steady rhythm as before, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everything had changed, because now, every step taken across that floor carried a different weight, a different awareness, a different understanding of what truly mattered. And as the reflection of the overhead lights shimmered across the surface she had just cleaned, one thing became unmistakably clear to everyone who had witnessed it. The value of a person had never been written on their uniform. And that day, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, she had reminded them exactly what dignity looks like. In the hours that followed, the rhythm of the office slowly returned, but it was not the same rhythm that had existed before. It was quieter, more deliberate, as if every movement now carried an awareness that had not been there that morning. Conversations were softer, pauses lasted longer, and even the smallest interactions seemed to hold a new kind of weight. Brandon sat, alone in a glass office that once felt like a symbol of his progress, his reflection staring back at him from the polished surface of the table. The room looked exactly as it had the day before, the same skyline stretching beyond the windows, the same neatly arranged files, the same carefully chosen furniture, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, the space did not feel like a reward. It felt like a responsibility he had misunderstood. His mind replayed the moment again and again, not the words he had spoken, but the ease with which he had spoken them, the confidence he had placed in assumptions that now felt hollow. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, the weight of realization settling deeper with every passing second. Down the hall, employees moved with a different kind of attention, greeting one another with small nods, brief acknowledgments that might have gone unnoticed before but now seemed intentional. A junior analyst paused as a maintenance worker passed by, offering a quiet, "Good morning," that carried more sincerity than routine. The worker smiled in return, surprised at first, then appreciative, and continued on. These were small changes, almost invisible to an outsider, but within the building, they marked the beginning of something new. Evelyn moved through the floors without announcement, no longer confined to a single space, her presence calm, steady, observant. She did not demand recognition. She did not expect it. But wherever she went, people noticed, not because of her title, but because of the way the atmosphere shifted when she was there. Not tense, not fearful, just aware. Late in the afternoon, she paused near a group of employees gathered around a shared workspace, their discussion focused, collaborative. One of them looked up, hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Good afternoon, Ms. Carter." The others followed, their greetings simple but genuine. Evelyn nodded, offering a small smile that carried quiet acknowledgement, then continued on without interrupting their work. There was no spectacle, no need for one. Respect had already begun to take root in a way that did not require enforcement. Back in his office, Brandon stood slowly, straightening his jacket out of habit before catching himself, realizing the gesture no longer held the meaning it once did. He stepped out into the hallway, his movements measured, his expression composed but thoughtful. As he walked past a member of the cleaning staff, he paused. For a brief moment, he considered continuing on, following the patterns that had defined his behavior for years. Then he stopped. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady, not forced, not performative, just present. The worker looked up, slightly surprised, then nodded. "Good afternoon." The exchange lasted only seconds, but it lingered, quiet and significant. Brandon continued walking, not looking back, but carrying that moment with him, understanding that change was not something declared in a meeting or written in a report. It was something lived, one interaction at a time. As the sun began to lower beyond the skyline, casting long reflections across the marble floors, Evelyn stood once more near the window, looking out over the city that never seemed to pause, never seemed to notice the small shifts that happened within its towers. She rested her hand lightly against the glass, her expression calm, thoughtful, not focused on what had happened, but on what would follow. Because moments like this were not endings. They were beginnings. And somewhere behind her, in the quiet movement of people learning to see each other differently, the true impact of that morning continued to unfold, steady, unseen, but undeniable. By the next morning, the building looked exactly the same, but the way people moved through it told a completely different story, as if something invisible had been rewritten overnight, something no one could point to directly, but everyone could feel. The elevators opened with their usual soft chime. Employees stepped out with coffee cups in hand. Conversations began in low voices, but there was a subtle pause in every interaction now, a fraction of a second where awareness lived before words were spoken. Brandon arrived earlier than usual, his reflection catching briefly in the mirrored elevator walls as he adjusted his jacket, not out of habit. This time, but out of intention, as if he were stepping into the day with a different understanding of who he needed to be. As the doors opened onto the executive floor, he hesitated for just a moment, taking in the quiet hum of activity, the same marble floors, the same glass offices, yet none of it felt quite as automatic as it once had. He stepped forward, his pace measured, his eyes noticing things he had never paid attention to before, the way a receptionist greeted a delivery worker with a polite nod, the way two analysts paused their conversation to let a maintenance cart pass without irritation. These were small things, easily overlooked, but now they stood out, clear and undeniable. Further down the hall, Evelyn moved with the same calm presence, her uniform unchanged, her expression steady, as if the previous day had not altered her routine at all. But it had changed everything around her. People greeted her now, not with exaggerated formality, but with quiet respect, simple acknowledgments that carried meaning without needing to announce it. She returned each greeting with the same measured nod, never lingering, never drawing attention, allowing the shift to belong to them rather than to herself. Brandon slowed as he approached her, the distance between them shrinking with each step, his mind replaying the moment that had brought him here, not as a source of embarrassment, but as a point of clarity he could not ignore. He stopped a few feet away, his posture straight but no longer rigid, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "Good morning," he said. The words were simple, but they carried something new, something that had not been there before. Evelyn looked up, meeting his gaze with the same calm composure. "Good morning," she replied. There was no tension in the exchange, no reminder of what had happened, only a quiet acknowledgement of the present. Brandon nodded once, not expecting more, not needing it, and continued on, understanding that respect was not something restored in a single moment, but something rebuilt over time. Throughout the morning, meetings continued, reports were discussed, decisions were made, but there was a difference in the tone, a shift in how voices were used, less sharp, more measured, as if people had become aware of the weight their words carried. At midday, a small group gathered in the conference room where Brandon had stood the day before, the same glass walls, the same polished table, but now the conversation felt different, less about proving authority and more about sharing responsibility. Evelyn did not attend the meeting, she did not need to. Her presence had already reshaped what took place inside it. Later, as the afternoon light stretched across the floors, Evelyn paused once more by the large windows overlooking the city, her reflection faint against the glass. Behind her, the office moved in a rhythm that felt quieter, steadier, more intentional. She watched for a moment, not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet understanding that change was never loud when it was real. And somewhere in that building, in the way people now chose their words, in the way they noticed one another, in the way silence was no longer used to overlook, but to reflect, something had taken root that would outlast the moment that started it. Because what had happened was not just about one man learning a lesson or one room falling silent. It was about an entire space remembering something it had almost forgotten. And that memory, once awakened, does not easily fade. By the end of the week, the transformation within the building was no longer subtle. It had settled into the culture itself, woven into the smallest interactions in ways that no policy or memo could ever enforce. People no longer rushed past one another without acknowledgement. Conversations paused when someone approached, not out of obligation, but out of awareness. The change was not loud, it did not demand attention, but it was everywhere. Brandon stood near the conference room window, reviewing a report, though his focus drifted more than usual. Numbers and projections filled the screen in front of him, but his attention kept returning to something less measurable, the tone of the room, the way his colleagues now engaged with one another, the quiet shift in how respect was given and received. He had spent years believing leadership was about control, about maintaining a certain image, about reinforcing hierarchy in ways that made authority visible. Now, that belief felt incomplete. Not wrong, but limited. He lowered the tablet slowly, his reflection faintly visible against the glass, and for the first time, he did not see someone who had lost something, but someone who had been given a clearer understanding of what had been missing all along. Across the floor, Evelyn moved as she always had, steady, focused, present, her actions unchanged but her impact undeniable. She paused briefly as she passed a small group of employees engaged in discussion, their voices collaborative, respectful, each person given space to speak without interruption. One of them looked up and nodded. "Good afternoon," he said. The others followed, their greetings simple, unforced. Evelyn returned the acknowledgement with a small nod, then continued on, her presence leaving behind a quiet reminder rather than a command. Later that afternoon, a junior employee hesitated near Brandon's office, holding a stack of documents, uncertain whether to interrupt. In the past, that hesitation might have gone unnoticed or been dismissed. But now Brandon saw it. He stepped forward slightly, his voice steady. "You can come in," he said. The employee entered, relieved, and explained her concern, her tone cautious at first, then more confident as she realized she was being heard. Brandon listened fully, not interrupting, not rushing, allowing the conversation to unfold at its own pace. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "That is a good point," he said. "Let us look at it together." The exchange was simple, but it carried something new, something that had not existed before. As she left, her posture straighter, her expression more assured, Brandon understood that leadership was not diminished by listening. It was defined by it. As the day moved toward evening, the light outside softened, casting long reflections across the marble floors that had witnessed everything from hurried footsteps to quiet realizations. Evelyn stood once more near the edge of the floor, her gaze moving across the space, not inspecting, not evaluating, but observing. The building no longer felt like a place divided by levels or titles. It felt connected, not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. Behind her, a quiet exchange unfolded as one employee held the door for another, a small gesture, easily overlooked, yet now it carried weight. These moments were not extraordinary. That was what made them powerful. They were real. They were consistent. And they were lasting. Brandon stepped out into the hallway once more, his movements no longer driven by urgency, but by intention. He paused briefly, looking across the floor, noticing the details that had once blended into the background, the interactions, the tone, the quiet respect that now existed without being demanded. He did not need to speak. He did not need to explain. He understood. And as Evelyn turned slightly, her eyes meeting his for just a moment, there was no need for acknowledgement beyond that. No words, no gestures, just a shared understanding that something had changed, not because it was forced, but because it was realized. And in that realization, something far more important than authority had taken its place. Something that could not be assigned, could not be worn, and could not be taken away. It could only be practiced, quietly, consistently, one moment at a time. Weeks passed, and what had once been a single moment of quiet correction had evolved into something far more enduring, something that could not be undone or forgotten, because it had become part of how people chose to see one another. The building no longer felt like a place divided by titles or roles, but a place defined by awareness, where even the smallest interactions carried intention. Morning greetings were no longer automatic, they were genuine. Conversations were no longer about proving who held authority, but about understanding who needed to be heard. And in the center of it all, without ever demanding attention, Evelyn continued exactly as she always had, steady, observant, present. She moved through the halls with the same calm rhythm, her uniform unchanged, her expression composed, yet the space around her had transformed in ways that spoke louder than any announcement ever could. Brandon stood near the same spot where everything had begun, his eyes following the movement of the floor, noticing details that once would have meant nothing to him. A manager paused to thank a staff member for a small task. A group of employees made space for someone pushing a cart without irritation. A conversation shifted tone when someone new joined, making room rather than closing ranks. These were not policies. These were choices. And they were being made every day. He exhaled slowly, the weight of that understanding settling into something steady, something permanent. Leadership, he realized, was not about being seen at the top. It was about what happened when no one was looking. Across the room, Evelyn paused briefly, her gaze lifting just enough to take in the scene, not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with quiet recognition. She had not forced this change. She had revealed it. And once revealed, it could not be unseen. Brandon took a step forward, then another, until he stood where he had once drawn a line that no longer existed. He did not speak. He did not need to. The moment itself carried everything that needed to be understood. Around him, the office moved with a rhythm that felt different, not slower, not faster, but more intentional, more human. And for the first time, that felt like progress. Evelyn turned slightly, her reflection catching faintly in the glass wall beside her. A simple figure in a gray uniform standing in a place built on ambition and success. Yet nothing about her presence felt out of place anymore. It felt foundational. As she reached for the mop once more, guiding it across the marble with the same steady motion as always, the reflection beneath her shifted, not just light and surface, but meaning. Because the floor she cleaned no longer reflected status alone. It reflected awareness. It reflected change. It reflected the quiet understanding that had taken hold in every corner of that building. And as the last traces of daylight faded beyond the skyline, leaving only the soft glow of the interior lights, one truth remained, clear and undeniable, settling into the space. Like something that had always belonged there. Respect is not something you assign to others. It is something you reveal about yourself. And on that day, without raising her voice, without asking for recognition, she had reminded them all what that truly means.